But in Acts chapter 25, back when the Apostle Paul became a believer, when he first became a believer, Jesus told him on day one, back in Acts chapter 9, verse 15, he said, Paul, you're going to be a witness before rulers. A witness before rulers. Now that sounds kind of exciting the first time you hear that. Wow, I'm going to be before kings and queens and emperors and important people. But how could you imagine how things would work out after, what that would actually look like? Two different things. Ultimately, the Lord would take him not just to Jerusalem, but to Rome. And not on first class on the boat to Rome. In the prison area, as a prisoner in chains. Back in the Gospels, Jesus talked about this. He talked about these situations where you would stand on trial, and in fact, it would be an opportunity to bear testimony. You're going to stand on trial in courts before people, and you're going to give a testimony, but there's two testimonies going on. The testimony the court wants to hear, and the testimony you're going to give about Jesus. Literal trials in courts of law would be opportunities to be a witness and give your salvation testimony. Now, there comes a point where you have to exercise faith in the words of Jesus. And you just have to trust God with your future. So many of us here in Canada, we don't even understand what this is. But I think we're getting close to that point in Canada. Now remember, Paul is the guy who wrote Romans 8:28, and he was living Romans 8:28 during this chapter. We know that all things work together for good for those who love Christ Jesus, called according to his purpose. All things work together for good. Sounds good. We love it. It's a beautiful thought, beautiful verse. But in the trial, when you are in the testing, when you are in the fire, in the fiery ordeal, when you're in the lion's den, you have to exercise faith at that moment. Some chapters back before this morning in Acts, Paul decided to take the gospel to Jerusalem and then to Rome. And, well, as it turned out, things took a different direction that nobody could have guessed. The prophet Agabus did give them a little hint of what was coming when he went up to Paul and he bound Paul's feet and his hands, and in a prophetic word said, this is what's going to happen to you when you go to Jerusalem. You're going to be bound. And so Paul was placed under arrest and imprisoned in Caesarea, as we saw last week, for 2 years. He had a number of trumped-up charges leveled against him. He began to appear before a number of officials and rulers on these trumped-up charges. And then, you know, you get to this chapter 4, chapter 25, it seems like things just sort of sit still for 2 years. It just seems like things are going nowhere for 2 years. And Paul would be in prison anywhere from 4 to 5 years as a total by the time we finish with him in Rome. So it seems like a dead end. And here we are at the end of the first 2 years, chapter 25, verse 1. Follow with me as we dive into this. Chapter 25, verse 1, it says, Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. So the governor Felix that we saw last week in the previous chapter, now we have Festus. Last week we had Felix. The governor Felix that we saw last week had been recalled to Rome in shame for his mismanagement. He was replaced by this new guy named Festus, who was 70 years old, and within 2 years of being in office here, he would die. Verses 2 and 3. And it says, And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning on an ambush to kill him on the way. All right, well, here we go again. the relentless opposition, the relentless hatred, the incredible dislike that they had for this man Paul, it's hard to comprehend. Even after a 2-year delay, the first request of this new governor was a favor, which was actually a plot to kill Paul. Imagine being that filled with that kind of hatred and that kind of bitterness. But that's what legalism does to a person. That's what religion, false religion, can twist a person into. You become so rigid, so judgmental, so unforgiving. And in their case, they actually thought they were doing it for God. That's the crazy thing here. Verses 4 and 5. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So he said, "Let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him." So this new governor, Festus, he was a man of the world, but he was wanting to follow Roman protocol. He wanted to follow Roman procedure. He wanted to follow the rules. And ultimately, this would be the thing that would protect the Apostle Paul. Following law and following procedure. Not looking for loopholes, not trying to reinterpret it, not creating new laws. This is the thing that protected Paul. And I know this doesn't sound all that exciting when I'm talking about this morning about this idea of God using the laws of the land to protect you. Doesn't sound exciting, but that is one of the ways that God works. God uses things like we see here. God used Paul's Roman citizenship. It was part of the plan all along. That was how Paul got a ticket to stand before all these different rulers and be able to speak without impunity, without any judgment upon him. They had to listen to him. They were forced to listen to Paul preach the gospel through his testimony. That's the important thing here, guys. And we see it once again in this chapter and the next chapter. Verses 6 and 8. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat in the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense." You get a little insight here into why Paul did not want to have the trial in Jerusalem. Why did Paul not want to have the trial in Jerusalem? Well, because the problem with Paul holding the trial in Jerusalem was that Festus would have to create a legal counsel from the people from that area, and he would have probably ended up picking people like the Sanhedrin or members of the Sanhedrin to be his legal advisors. And that's what Paul feared. And Paul knew that. And so he says, no, I don't want to go on trial in Jerusalem. And he wanted to preach in Jerusalem, and he did. But now he said, no, I want to be on trial in Caesarea. That's what Paul feared, was this legal counsel that Festus would pick up around him. And so Paul knew that that course of action would deny him justice. And so what does Paul do? Well, take a look here. Follow with me. It says in verse 9, and Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these before me?" But Paul said, "I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I had done no wrong, as to you yourself know very well." Verse 11, "If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not speak to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar." This is what Paul was worried. He was concerned about getting an unfair trial in Jerusalem. And so he goes and he says, follow me with this. He says, "I appeal to Caesar." Incredible words to come from someone's mouth back then, but if you were a Roman citizen and you felt that justice was not taking its course, as a Roman citizen, anywhere within the Roman Empire, you could utter those words and you would go to Rome and stand before the emperor. Now, you better have a pretty good argument. You don't want to waste the emperor's time. You don't want to irritate the emperor. Paul felt he was legally correct. He felt he was innocent, but he saw this as an opportunity to preach the gospel. And so Paul makes the famous statement, I appeal to Caesar. And this caught Festus off guard. When you read it, you look at it, he did not expect this. And so what did Festus do? Take a look at verse 12. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, and there it is there, he conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. And there it is. What you see in this verse, this is Festus's council, his legal advisors. They're in Caesarea. If he had had the trial in Jerusalem, there would have been a different legal council of advisors, and it would have been guys who would have just put the noose around his neck or had him stoned or beheaded or whatever it was. And so Paul knew it was a death sentence. And so that's what's going on here in this chapter. So he appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar he would go eventually. It was going to be like a first-class ticket on the express. He would go as a prisoner, but he would still go. And I came across this little quote this week, and I really like this quote because I was thinking about Paul here in the entire book of Acts. It says this, we are faced with great opportunities, brilliantly disguised as impossible situations. I like that. We are faced with great opportunities, brilliantly disguised as impossible situations. I like hearing that. I don't like living through that. I like the part where it says we are faced with great opportunities. I like that part. Do you like that part? Yeah. The second part I could do without. Brilliantly disguised as impossible situations. Really? All right. But you need to look at things through faith, and that's what we see here every single time when Paul is on trial. All right. So verse 13, follow with me. Now when some days had passed, Agrippa, the king, and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. So here comes the Herod family again. We keep seeing the Herod family again and again and again. This was Agrippa II, Agrippa II, the great-grandson of the Agrippa that you read in the Gospels who killed the babies in Jerusalem when Jesus was born. So the great-grandson. Agrippa II, or Agrippa II, came with Bernice, who was his half-sister and also his lover. They had an incestuous relationship, which was the scandalous talk of the Roman capital. Everybody in Rome knew about this relationship between these two. And I could tell you a whole bunch more about this couple, but you get the idea of what kind of people these people were. Well, verse 14, reading on, and it says, and as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man left prisoner by Felix, and when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against them, asking for a sentence of condemnation against them. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had the opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay. He makes himself sound pretty good. I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case as of such evils as I supposed. Verse 19. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. being at a loss on how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. Well, there you go. You have Festus telling Agrippa, spinning the story, saying, as soon as I found this, I know he's a Roman citizen, I heard him right away, and as a favor to him, kind of thing, I said, hey, let's do the trial down in Jerusalem, when really it was a favor to his accusers. And he knows he's got to send him to Rome, but he's a political hot potato because, well, what charges do I write in the accompanying paperwork? What charges? So Festus had no idea what to do with this. And by bringing Agrippa in, who was a bit more of an expert, he was an expert in Jewish thinking and religious groups and all that, but Festus had no idea what the differences were between the Jews and these new believers called Christians or followers of Jesus or followers of the way, as they were calling it. But one thing that's interesting that stands out, as Festus gives his report to Agrippa, something was clearly laid before Agrippa by Festus, because Paul presented it to Festus. Paul made it very clear to Festus. Festus, he tells it right here in his report to Agrippa. And it's as plain as day. Paul made sure that Festus heard the core ideas of the gospel. It was so clear that Festus, when Governor Festus tells Agrippa, this is what's going on with this guy named Paul, he brings up the two most important things about the gospel. And I just read it. Jesus died, and Jesus rose from the dead. In the ESV it says, Paul asserted himself that Jesus is alive still. And he impressed it upon him. Now sometimes I think maybe we should be like that a little bit more in our conversations. Well, yes, I go to church. Well, what do they believe? Well, Jesus died on the cross and he rose from the dead. I think maybe we could be just a little bit more, Jesus, he really did rise from the dead. Like he really is alive. You've heard this, but you know that he's really alive. The way some of us share it, it's like we're dead. You would think we're dead and we need to be raised to life. The way we communicate it, we're just no excitement, no faith, no belief, this has changed my life. I've met the resurrected Jesus. He really is alive. And the word that's used there, it's used 3 times in the New Testament. But this is the one place where it's used, it's a claim. And he's asserting it, and he's pressing the point. I sometimes wonder if maybe in our conversations, in our attempts to witness, maybe we should be just have a little bit more assertion. He really is alive. You know that, right? I'm not crazy. I'm not nuts. You know me after all these years that I'm working with you or whatever. And, maybe they will say you're nuts behind your back, but in their heart of hearts, they know you're probably one of the most rational, sane people they've ever met. Well, Festus, maybe he couldn't recollect all the other details, but he got this right. And folks, that's our job. It's to make Jesus clear to people. Don't get sidetracked. Don't get off track. Make it about Jesus. I know we like to talk about this thing and that thing, but keep talking about Jesus, his death and his resurrection. That is the gospel. 2 sides of the same coin. So if you're here this morning and you leave and somebody asks you, well, what jumped out at you about the sermon? Well, the gospel is very clear, the death of Jesus on the cross for my sins and his resurrection from the dead. And Jesus really is alive. And then in the back of your mind, just don't say it. Mean it. Assert it. He really is alive. I believe that. 2 sides of the same coin. Anyways, Festus was able to report it back very clearly. He's already preaching the gospel to Agrippa, the king. Verse 21. Moving along here, it says this. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, you will hear him. Verse 23, so on the next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. I notice one thing that jumps out. Agrippa came in with Bernice, and it says with great what? Pomp. Came in with great pomp. I guess nowadays you would call this a power couple. If there was TV cameras and reporters and people taking pictures, they would go, look at this power couple. Aren't they the darlings? Aren't they? They're everything. Who cares if he's sleeping with his half-sister? I guess some people think that's okay nowadays too. But anyways, that's besides the point. Somebody by the name of William Barclay, scholar, knows about New Testament backgrounds. He writes this. He knows all about tradition and culture and all the different things. But he said this. I like this. He wrote this about this situation. They would have on their purple robes of royalty and a gold circlet of the crown on their brows, their head. Doubtless, Festus, to do honor to the occasion, had donned the scarlet robe which the governor wore on state occasions. And then after they came in came the important officials, the dignitaries. I mean, this was a big thing. This was the entertainment actually as well, not just a legal proceeding. And then after everybody came in and sat down, in came the Apostle Paul in chains. All right? Verse 24. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man, about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I have found that he had done nothing deserving death, and as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my Lord about him. Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. And we're going to stop there. Next week, we're going to get into Paul's defense before this court, and he's going to give his testimony. It's called the 4-minute testimony because you can measure it in 4 minutes. But let me just finish with this morning. Festus basically said, I don't know what to charge this guy with. I don't know what to write down concerning his charges. Which means, basically, well, it pretty much sums it up. Paul was innocent. There were no charges. There was no real evidence. There was no crimes. It was all about trying to shut down the gospel. That was the original intention, to shut down the gospel. Nothing more, nothing less. And Paul appealed to Caesar, which at that time was Caesar Nero, terrible man, blamed the burning down of Rome on the Christians. But Nero would hear the gospel through the Apostle Paul. That's one thing we know about history. That terrible man, that evil man, heard the gospel from the lips of the Apostle Paul. So every time you hear his name or you think about, just remember, he heard the gospel for one of the great preachers of the faith. I'm going to finish with this, I want to bring it together and then finish off this morning. We've talked a lot about Paul standing on trial, how it was a trial on many levels for him, how it was God's plan, how he had to trust God, how he had to believe God to make this somehow work out together for good, because that was a big part of his thinking. But at the end of Paul's life, just before his execution, Paul wrote what we believe is his last letter, at least what we have of his discovered letters, and it's 2 Timothy. And you can turn to 2 Timothy right now. But in 2 Timothy, so that you got 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and then Titus. Once you're in that zone, you'll know. But in 2 Timothy, his last letter before he's executed, by beheading by sword, it's believed. It's like he's writing this letter to Timothy, his protege, his assistant, and he's passing the torch to Timothy. And in the very last letter, in the very last chapter, you get to chapter 4, you get verses 16 and 17, and this is what he wrote. Take a look. I have it up on the screen there as well. At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be held against them. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles hear it, so that so was I rescued from the lion's mouth. So when Paul says, I was rescued from the lion's mouth, I mean, quite literally, he may very well have been rescued from the lion's mouth this first time. All right? In Acts. Here in 2 Timothy, it is the last time when he's in Rome. And he's actually put to death, it's believed. But look what he says. He says, the Lord was with me. The Lord was with me. The Lord was right there all the time. That's all you need to know when you're standing on trial, when you're being put to the test, when you're standing before man's court of law. Festus had a way of twisting his words. He had a way of twisting his words when presenting it to the king, to Agrippa. He spun it a certain way. His accusers twisted words and spun it a simple way. And it's interesting how people will use the courts of law and laws and legal argumentation, and they'll use the language of morality to make it sound like, well, I am doing what's just and right, and what you're doing is immoral and dark. And I think we're going to see more and more of that in Canada. I'm not going to get into it too much, but I think we even saw this week here in BC. We see people who are highly politically motivated, who just want to shut down Christians or shut down anybody who's willing to take a stand. And that's the times in which we live. And it's happening here in beautiful British Columbia. And I just take comfort in the fact that Jesus says, the Lord was with me. That Paul says, the Lord was with me. He was there. He even says, when I stood my first time and everybody deserted me, it was just Paul standing there by himself. The Lord was with me.